Hello, my name's Elisa Gray, and tonight I'm going to be talking about men in witchcraft. This is quite a big subject, really, bigger than one may expect. So we're going to be looking at it from the point of view of, how many men were killed in the witch trials. Was it anything like the amount of women? Also, why men were accused of witchcraft, which is very interesting. And also some of the words attached to men in witchcraft. Things like warlock, wizard. Why are these words all different for men, and yet it's usually witch for a woman? So yes, I hope you enjoy it, and I shall try and make it as interesting as possible for you. Okay, so it's a universal truth that witches are women. It's changing a little bit now, but when I was younger, a fair few years ago, if you said witch, people thought of the Wizard of Oz, the sort of the green woman with the big pointed nose and chin, in a black dress on a broomstick cackling. And obviously the textbook meaning of the word witch, in its feminine form, which is wick, W-I-C-C-E, was woman who used magic to do harm. So obviously witchcraft is very much, and has been for many years, associated with harmful magic. Of course, this word is being reclaimed in the modern world, with lots of different people practicing witchcraft, and seeing it in a very more different way to then. But that's, that was the stereotype. To the point where several scholars have put forward theories that the witch trials were actually a form of gendercide, as scholars believe that 80% of those killed in the witch trials were women. But obviously there were men as well. Some who were married to suspected witches, some were seen as witches in their own right, and even members of the clergy were accused of witchcraft. So let's start right at the beginning. We'll go back to the Spanish Inquisition, with Henrik Kramer's infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches. Probably the most misogynistic book that's ever been written. Lots of woman-hating tortures and things devised for when witchcraft became a crime of heresy. But 33 pages of that volume contained information regarding men. Those men who were accused of witchcraft. But what's really interesting is the crimes that they were accused of. Obviously, with women, it was things like maiming, killing, with harmful curses. With men, it was shooting arrows at the Holy Cross. That's one example. Which, in today's world, we're probably thinking, so that was nothing then. But obviously back in the day, that would be seen as something terrible, shooting an arrow at the Holy Cross, but yet still not murder, and maiming or the sort of thing that women were accused of. But they got a mention, basically. If we look back at the ancient world, it was men who used magic. It was a male-dominated practice, magic. Obviously, the Persian mages, Greek men who carried cursed tablets to protect their businesses. There was the Ashipu, who were doing the funerary rites, the Baru, who were the diviners, working in with the king. And these were all men, and it was sort of seen as very positive, or what they term white magic. These are not racist terms, black and white magic. It's how they were sort of seen, viewed. Positive magic being white, harmful magic being black, or stroke evil. And so the Baru and the Ashipu and all these sort of people, men, were seen as white, positive magic, whereas the sorcerer was seen as a black magician, evil, and it was very much associated with women. A lot of men worked on anti-witchcraft rituals, which dated back to Babylonia, and they were passed down over several centuries. So basically, anti-witchcraft rituals, the distinction between witchcraft and divine magic, which men used, was already in existence all those years ago. So men, white magic; women, black magic. So looking at the statistics from the witch trials, we can definitely see a trend. It was mainly women who was killed for crimes of witchery. Obviously, the belief that women were connected to the devil, that witchcraft, dark magic, came from the devil, and that women were easily affected by this, whereas men weren't so easily affected. So we have a table here, and you can sort of, get the general idea from this. Hungary, for example, 1,482 women compared to 160 men. Scotland, 2,208 women as opposed to 413 men. And it sort of follows that trend until we start to get right down to the bottom of the table. And if you notice, Finland, it was 325 women, 316 men. Not much difference there. And as we're looking at Burgundy, the scale tips the other way. So we've got 76 women and 83 men. Estonia, 77 women, 116 men. Normandy, 103 women, 278 men. And Iceland, this massive disparity, 10 women, 110 men. Why Iceland? Some people have put forward the theory that the Vikings went to Iceland. Paganism was very strong there, and pagan ways were sort of retained through time. And paganism obviously was not Christianity, seen as Satanism by the Christians, Catholic Church. Excuse me. And men were considered to be, sort of in this paganism. That's one possibility. In Normandy, interestingly, it was the shepherd who was targeted. And you look at the history of witchcraft, it was often the crone, the old woman with the warts and everything, who was mistrusted and targeted for witchcraft. In Normandy, it was the shepherd. Maybe the fact he lived away from people, the isolation of being with his flock, and people didn't trust him, possibly. But certainly very interesting anomalies to the trend. So, foreigners, outsiders, Romany gypsies, these sort of people were accused. And there was one very famous case, actually, in Iceland. It was the Curchable witch trial. And Reverend John Magnusson began waking in the night to the sensation of cats and mice crawling over his feet, of a dog with red-hot claws pinning his body to the bed. He had no doubt that he'd been bewitched. And he knew who'd done it. And basically he accused a father and son, both named Jon Janssen, of doing this witchery to him. And while drunk, the older Jon Janssen said, yes, I sent a spirit out to torment you. Whether it was just drunken folly because he didn't like the Reverend or what, but the Reverend took it very seriously. And despite the fact that his night's terrors actually did stop, he had both father and son burned at the stake on April the 10th in 1656. A very, very interesting case, and it's not one for the faint-hearted, was the case of the Ludon Possessions. And this was actually made into a film, a Ken Russell, very strange film, 1971, called The Devils. And it was banned for many years, a semi-pornographic movie trying to depict the strange things that went on during the Ludon Possessions. A very, very famous case. Basically, a French Catholic priest called Urbain Grandier was accused by an Ursuline nun of witchery. So Sister Jeanne of the Angels, who was a physically deformed, hunchbacked nun, who was unmarriable, which is why she was in the convent in the first place, because obviously if you couldn't marry your daughter off, you put her into the church. She saw Grandier walking past the convent, the Ursuline convent, and immediately fell in love with him. Obviously, sexual attraction, lust, etc. And she began to fantasize about Grandier. And of course, the other nuns in the convent soon got the idea that something was a bit wrong with Sister Jeanne, because she was doing strange things that she shouldn't be doing. And so basically, in the end, she actually attracted the attention of the priests, the higher up in the clergy, who came and investigated the situation. And she said that Grandier had sent his spirit out to make love to her, and that each one of her sisters in the convent had been, seduced by a demon that Grandier had brought with him. Now, normally, this would be seen as hilarious, that they would sort of be like, oh dear, yep, we can see what's going on here. But it just so happened to coincide with a time when France was being unified, and any city with a wall around it, the city walls were coming down, and they were losing their independence. But Ludon actually had a letter from the king saying that they wouldn't do that, they wouldn't take the wall of Ludon down. And Grandier was very, very insistent that the wall stay up. And obviously the powers that be wanted this wall down. Also, he'd made an enemy of the Cardinal, Cardinal Richelieu, because he didn't agree with celibacy. Grandier thought that priests were entitled to marry, and he wrote a text on that. And he also wrote a satirical attack on the Cardinal, and the Cardinal didn't like him at all. So obviously this was politically motivated. They wanted the wall down. Cardinal Richelieu didn't like Grandier. So when this accusation was made, it was a great way to get rid of him. So basically they went with it. It was an absolutely ridiculous set of events. It became a public spectacle. People went to the convent to watch the nuns cavorting, barking like dogs, performing strange acts in front of an audience, and doing things very out of character, because they were, in inverted commas, possessed by Grandier. And they were basically told to do it. Otherwise they would be in trouble. And they arrested him. They did a trial. They had written a devil's pact with Grandier's signature on it, and insisted he'd sign this pact. And Grandier didn't admit to anything at all, because he'd done nothing wrong. He even he saw Sister Jeanne, and said, why are you doing this to me? And she just looked at him and said, devil, at his face, and he couldn't understand it. And basically they tortured him. They smashed his legs between blocks of wood until the bone marrow trickled from his skin. And then they half made him walk, dragged him to the stake in the middle of the town, and he was supposed to receive the kiss of peace from a priest and be strangled before the fire actually burned him, because he was a priest at the end of the day. But the priest spat in his face and didn't perform the last act of mercy, allow the executioner to do that, and he was burned alive. Terrible, agonising death for Grandier, as a political scapegoat. There's a book actually, the Ludon Possessions, I would recommend. If you've got a strong stomach, I would recommend you read it. It's very interesting. There is also a guy called Baron Gilles de Rais, who was a knight and lord from Brittany, a leader in the French army and companion in arms of Joan of Arc, and in history is remembered as a notorious child murderer and as one in league with the devil. He basically kidnapped a cleric during a dispute at the church of Saint Affian de Mermont, and this act prompted the Bishop of Nantes to investigate de Rais, uncovering evidence of barbaric crimes against children. And again, this is not one to read if you've got a weak stomach, because some of the things that de Rais was accused of doing to children are quite bizarre, to be fair, and extremely over the top, very over the top crimes. But with, sort of digging and investigation much later, it seems that de Rais was actually innocent of what he was accused. And this idea has persisted, that he was the victim of a plot or act of revenge by the Catholic Church or the French state, as the Duke of Brittany was given authority to prosecute de Rais and receive all the titles to his former lands after his conviction. And de Rais was hung in October 1440, and obviously these lands were then claimed. So again, was this a political scapegoat? Was this somebody who was a convenient scapegoat in order for somebody to gain land and money, etc.? So obviously these were on the continent. We're talking about France, but what of England? Obviously King James I was obsessed with witches. He even wrote the book Demonology, and he was very hot on sort of investigating witchcraft accusations. But by the time King Charles was on the throne, it almost ended the witch craze, and he demanded a far more stringent proof of witchery. But by 1642, when England was in the grip of civil war, along came Matthew Hopkins. And Matthew Hopkins was a self-proclaimed witchfinder. He was only very young. He was in his 20s, a bit of an entrepreneur, I suppose, for his day, and decided to call himself a witchfinder, don the big hat and the boots and go off around the East Anglia area hunting out witches, and he was paid £1 for every witch that he proved was a witch, basically. So there was a good money incentive for him. And torture was illegal in Britain at this time, but Hopkins kind of danced on the edge, the borderline of torture, and he was the guy who sort of introduced pricking, and birthmarks, warts, skin tags, were pricked with a needle or sharp implement, because obviously the devil's mark is not supposed to bleed or feel pain. And he was obviously looking for this evidence of a diabolical pact that had been made. He also used sleep deprivation and swimming, where he would throw somebody into the river, tied up on a rope, and then pull them out and throw them in again, pull them out, throw them in again, repeatedly. Obviously, if you sink, you're innocent. If you float, you're guilty, sort of thing. And the swimming test was done to 80-year-old Reverend John Lowe, after being deprived of sleep, and he was stripped and thrown into the water to make him confess to witchcraft. And this is simply because his parishioners didn't like him. When Matthew Hopkins arrived, they didn't like Reverend Lowe, so, well, he's a witch, get rid of him. And Reverend Lowe did indeed confess to witchcraft, because, yes, everybody did who was tortured. But he wouldn't admit to making a pact with the devil. He was absolutely so because he was so innocent. Despite everything, he wouldn't say that. very strong old fella. That's Matthew. Also, he humiliated and degraded a very old lady called Elizabeth Clark, who had one eye and one leg, who was stripped and checked for witches' marks in front of people. It's a horrible person doing that to somebody so old, and horrible, very, very horrible person. Okay, so examining the words attached to male witches is also very interesting. And obviously the most common word used to express that a witch is male is the word warlock. And up until around 1000, the year 1000, it meant oath breaker or deceiver, and became associated with witchcraft when a man accused of witchery was seen to have broken his oath to God. Obviously, being a witch myself, I've got several witchy friends, and some of my male friends absolutely hate the word warlock, find it offensive if somebody, when somebody finds out that they're a witch, and says, "Oh, you're a warlock," they're immediately offended by that, because they don't consider themselves to be an oathbreaker, because obviously, that is not, the case, as they see it. So no, warlock is kind of falling out now of the language, I think, a lot. There are a few old school people who still use it, and a lot of films, I think, were responsible for that, for keeping the word warlock attached to male witches. The word wizard appeared in the English language in about 1550, originating from the Middle English word weis, meaning wise. And wizard is a word that is loaded with stereotypes. Obviously, Gandalf from Lord of the Rings springs to mind, a white-haired, bearded old man who wears a pointed hat and commands high magic, and certainly doesn't seem to fit the image of many modern male witches at all. That's the sort of the Gandalf, Saruman kind of thing, the old man, the white hair. It's loaded, that word. In the early 18th century, thaumaturge, by a medieval Latin from the Greek, which means marvel or wondrous worker of wonders, miracles, was a word associated with men. And the notion being that a man can control, miraculous magic, such as the conjuring of spirits, necromancy, like a mage, really. But that word was never associated with women, it was always men. The man is the miracle worker. The word witch was born in 890 when King Alfred the Great wrote it in the Book of Doom, and was spelled Wic, W-I-C-C-E, in its feminine form, and Wicca in the masculine. Is technically a gender-neutral word, which some men are now reclaiming in the modern world. Obviously Wicca, the word Wicca now has many different connotations, with Gerald Gardner and Wiccan. But indeed Gardner had a lot to do with the revival of witchcraft, and the mixing of men and women in witchcraft via Wiccan. He also brought witchcraft into the public eye, making it a bit more accessible. And, magical groups that were once male-dominated, such as the Order of the Golden Dawn, these sort of esoteric groups, which remained a mystery to the general public, really, and still do. But they did open the doors to women. So witches today are generally accepted as both male and female. But just like some esoteric orders kept their doors closed to women for many years, some covens discouraged the inclusion of men, as in, for example, Dianic covens. Dianic witches worship the goddess through all three of her aspects, maiden, mother and crone. Rituals and worship can vary, but they all have feminist aspects and come from a feminist standpoint. So indeed, yes, there are some covens that are very much keep the man out. But then, that, as I said, that is kind of mirrored in some male-dominated magical orders keeping women out for many years. Okay, men can indeed practice the craft, worship deities if they choose to, set up an altar, etc. But can men actually do magic? Now, this is a big one because I think there's people out there in the world today who don't think anybody can do magic. At one time, witchcraft was synonymous with magic. You were assumed as a witch to be able to curse, to cure, to do all these things via magic. But in today's world, witchcraft is much more of a self-help practice in some respects. Manifestation, sort of the altar, the seasonal offerings, crystal use. It's magic doesn't kind of come as a compulsory component of witchcraft anymore. So can women do magic? And that's one for a debate for the future. Obviously, some people think, yes, they can. Some people, no, they can't. So let's just assume for a minute, let's play for a minute that women can do magic. Women witches can do magic. Well, can a man? In the 1600s, women were thought to be better at using magic than men because of their ability to gestate life in the womb. So their connection to nature, basically. But men were in positions of power in the world of alchemy and in the clergy. The alchemists not only attempted to turn lead into gold, but also attempted to make a homunculus or tiny humanoid creature. In essence, to create organic life without the use of a womb. So this was a man-made abomination grown in a gourd. And the alchemists, this is true, people go, really? But it's true. They would take a gourd, a sort of a part of the husk of a plant or something, to make a container and put in different herbs and sunstones and a proportion of semen and other bits and bobs, and believe that this would kind of ferment into a tiny human, completely man-made, no woman, no womb, and that this thing would be alive. And there's even been sightings. People insist they've seen back in the day, homunculi, the notion of the little helper, the thing that'll do your bidding, very much like the Jewish golem, or a witch doing mandrake root in a vat to try and make it come to life. This little helper. So yeah, there to go. Alchemists were certainly using some form of magic, as we sort of perceive it. And also, there were several popes who were said to summon demons. Pope Sylvester II was believed to have made a pact with a female demon called Meridiana, who aided him in his endeavours. Cardinal Benno, who was a supporter of the anti-popes and therefore was biased against the Pope, wrote that Sylvester was regularly waited on by demons and that by their help he had obtained the papal crown. He wrote that the devil to whom Sylvester had sold his soul had faithfully promised that he should live until he had celebrated High Mass at Jerusalem. So yes, indeed, men have been linked with magic very much as women, really, throughout history when you dig and look. But what is implied through these historical examples is that men use magic to further their career, to gain power and knowledge, whereas women use magic solely for doing harm in the eyes of the powers that be. Much like in Christopher Marlowe's Faust, where Faust sells his soul for knowledge, basically, while you've got the witches in Macbeth, who just want to kill and cause havoc in the kingdom. Also, men were often burned for political reasons or monetary gain, whereas women were killed because they were believed to be evil. At one point, you just had to be a woman, really, to be accused of witchcraft. It was almost like, woman became synonymous with evil at one point. But in most cases, apart from places like Iceland and Normandy, which we've looked at, but sort of nearer home, men were accused for slightly different reasons quite often. So obviously the Oxford Dictionary definition of a witch, a woman who is believed to have magic powers, especially to do evil things, that's still there. That stereotype is still there. And sadly, it's going to take a long time to break that stereotype. Even though, I like to call myself a cunning woman, because a cunning woman could do both healing and harming. Much like Granny Demdike in the Pendle Witches, when Alison Devizes said that she couldn't take the curse off because Alison said she was a witch, she'd put the curse on, but Granny could take it off because she was a cunning woman. And obviously that gives so much more scope for witchcraft power, both dark and light, nothing but the balance. Whereas the word witch is very damning, it's very dark only. But indeed, it seems to be the only word that we've got, really, that that people are reclaiming, both men and women. But that stereotype of the female on the broomstick with the cat and the pointed hat, is going to take some breaking, even though many men now are being very loud and proud about being witches. And men indeed have always been associated in some way here and there with the craft. So I do hope that you enjoyed that. It is a very big subject. It's a very interesting subject. There's lots out there if you feel like doing some research on it. But I would certainly definitely have a look at the Ludon Possessions, as I say, if you've got a strong stomach. And just sort of investigate the notion, because it's quite, women, obviously somebody said to me about, women, like, thinking that women were just the same as they are now back then. But, a woman in the 1600s had no rights, no, nothing really, there were, especially the poor, obviously just really chattels. But men had power. Men still had power positions. So yes, women were accused of witchcraft a lot because they were easy to accuse. They were easily victimized. But a man with power, that's quite an interesting concept. You know, somebody being accused of witchcraft, who's got power, is either a priest or a lord or whatever. But ultimately, these people were still fell victim to the system, and were still executed. So, yeah, as I say, I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope that I can give you a talk again in the future. Thank you very much.